Okay, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening, everyone that's watching at home, for joining us for the Spotsylvania 300 lecture series. I'm here with Frank O'Reilly, and let me introduce him. He is the author of the book Stonewall Jackson at Fredericksburg and the Fredericksburg Campaign, Winter War on the Rappahannock. He has worked at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, written numerous articles on the American Civil War and the Mexican War for national and international journals, and appeared on multiple documentaries. He has also lectured on military history to conferences all over, from the Pentagon to the United Kingdom. He is the National Park Service lead historian at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, and he is currently writing a book on the 1862 Battle of Malvern Hill and the 7 Days Battle around Richmond. Thanks for joining me this evening, Frank.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting for me to be with you.
All right, so I'll let you take it away. We'll go ahead and pull up your PowerPoint and we'll get started. And for the folks at home, when we're done, we'll do a question and answer portion. So feel free to put your comments and questions in and we'll take them at the end. All right, so let me pull that full screen.
Well, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be with you tonight and to spend a little bit of time talking about Spotsylvania and its 300 years and one of its more important legacies. When you think about the 300 years of Spotsylvania County, this is a really noteworthy place. It's a fabulous place of growth and prosperity in its history. It was a beacon of freedom for some. It was a place of strife and conflict for others. It was always important to the history of Virginia, but Spotsylvania was elevated to national importance when it became the crossroads of the Civil War. It saw some of its citizens go off to war in 1861, and then it saw war come home to Spotsylvania in 1862 and 1863 and 1864. The war had transitioned through a number of different rubrics over the course of that time. 1861 was, for the lack of a better term, in the D's, a year of defiance. It was a year of secession. 1862 was a year of definition, in which both sides wound up determining the terms and the stakes for this war. 1863 was a year of determination, in which the war ratcheted up in its intensity, and some really profound bloodletting started to happen at that point. And 1864 was the year of decision. That is the year that the war would reach its pinnacle in its intensity, because it was in the forefront of a presidential election year in the North. Other communities had felt the hard hand of the war for a brief moment in its past. Antietam and Sharpsburg for a day in September 1862, Gettysburg for 3 days of intense fighting. And it required years for them to recuperate. But Spotsylvania County was unique and different in that it not only saw the war come, but the war stayed and the war intensified. And that happened here more than in any other community in the country. Spotsylvania County was literally the most disputed piece of land on the entire North American continent. And the Overland Campaign of 1864 marked the beginning of perhaps the worst crucible of fighting the Civil War had ever known. It was the beginning of a contest between the war's two great captains, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. The stakes in 1864 were frighteningly high. It was a time when the North faced a presidential election and a very clear decision to be made. Abraham Lincoln, the Republican incumbent, had promised that he could finish the war and restore the Union, but in the course of 4 years had not come close to even seeing success at the end of the struggle. The person who was running against him as the Democratic candidate was the former commander of the Union Army in Virginia, and that was General George B. McClellan. McClellan was hailed by many as one of America's foremost military minds. He was considered the young Napoleon in American circles. And it was his opinion that the war could not be won and that it was time to end the fighting and bring the boys home. So voters had to decide whether they would believe in Abraham Lincoln and the promise that he could end the war and restore the Union, or look towards the Democratic candidate and end the fighting and stop the killing. With that in mind, Abraham Lincoln was going to pull out the stops. The best way to reassure the voters that the war is won or about to be won was through positive military victory, a decisive action in the field. And with that in mind, Abraham Lincoln elevated Ulysses S. Grant to supreme command of all the United States armies. He would be the commander of every field army working for the North at this point. His purpose in 1864 was to get Abraham Lincoln reelected. And the way that translates in military terms is simple. Ulysses S. Grant had to win, and win at any cost. Opposed to him in Virginia was General Robert E. Lee, who was also extremely well aware of the significance of the upcoming election. And while Grant's objective was simply to win, Lee's objective was a little bit more nuanced. His purpose in 1864, he didn't necessarily have to win himself. He just had to not lose. If he had succeeded in not losing, then Grant would have been thwarted in trying to win. The other thing that Robert E. Lee was looking to do was to inflict heavy casualties on the Union Army. Those casualty lists would be published throughout the North, and people of the North would be asking what the cost was for the loss of their loved ones. If Lee had successfully not lost, the unsatisfactory answer for Northern families was nothing had been achieved for the loss of their loved ones. That would create disillusionment, frustration, anger, and perhaps that would translate at the polls with people voting for McClellan rather than Lincoln. So everything that happened in 1864 is largely driven by an election. Now, one of the things that we think about when we think about the North versus the South, the federal forces of the United States and the Confederate forces of the South, is that we're taught that there are two types of war that they can wage: a war of attrition and a war of annihilation. A war of attrition is traditionally favored by large nations with large resources that can outlast their opponents and grind them down ultimately. A war of annihilation was the exact opposite. It was favored by small nations with small resources who knew that they couldn't go the distance with a larger force. So their option was to go on a military campaign and try to seek out the decisive moment as quickly as possible, to strike at the jugular, as it were, and make it a one and done campaign before they were too weak to be able to inflict their will. Normally, people would associate a war of attrition with the Union Army and with Ulysses S. Grant. His name has often been associated with it. And a nation that needs to resolve things quickly, one would associate Robert E. Lee with being a war of annihilation. But in 1864, those two are going to wind up flip-flopping their types of war. Because General Grant, as much as people like to say he's waging a war of attrition in 1864, was not. Part of the problem with the war of attrition is that it requires a long, extended period of time before you can grind an opponent into submission. 1864, Grant didn't have a lot of time. He was on a particular political clock and had to get decisive results to impact the voters before the election in November of 1864. So instead of trying to just outlast his opponent, he needed to find a decisive moment of military victory in the field. He set out to wage a war of annihilation. Now, for Lee, typically looking for that decisive score, 1864, that political clock starts working for his advantage. He didn't have to outlast the Union indefinitely. He just had to outlast Grant through the election. So he was all for extending things, dragging things on to have an impact on the election. So, in one sense, he was waging a war of attrition. Their campaign started in the first week of May 1864 when Union and Confederate forces moved into the wilderness of Spotsylvania, a 75 square mile dense tangled thicket that hovered on the banks of the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. The two great captains of this war, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, were about to pair off in battle for the very first time in their careers. It's interesting that as these two went off to meet in battle at the wilderness, that they really didn't have a very high opinion of each other. Both of them thought the other was tremendously overrated. Grant's impression of Lee was that Lee, fighting in the East, fought against the likes of generals like George B. McClellan and John Pope, Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker. The Union Army was led by conservative, if not timid, commanders. And it wasn't that Lee was so great in Grant's mind, is that the Union Army was afraid to win. And by default, Lee was a great victor. Lee's impression of Grant was also not very flattering. Grant had fought out in the western part of the war, largely in the Mississippi Valley. And as far as Lee was concerned, he was fighting against the likes of John B. Floyd and Simone Bolivar Buckner, Braxton Bragg, Joseph Eagleston Johnston, Albert Sidney Johnston, and John C. Pemberton, who were not exactly A-list Confederate generals. And so under those conditions, who doesn't win against those types of Confederate leaders? Also, the geography out west was dramatically different than the geography in Virginia. Just consider the rivers for a moment. The Mississippi River or the Tennessee River primarily moved north and south. They're major highways of invasion for Union forces heading into the heart of the Southern Confederacy. But here in Virginia, the rivers don't go north and south. They go east and west. And to get from Washington to Richmond, one doesn't travel up rivers, one travels over rivers. Every one of them had to be crossed, and every one of them would be a major obstacle. So, in Lee's opinion, Grant had it easy, and that his introduction to Virginia would be incredibly hard. May 4th, 1864, the Union forces enter into the wilderness by crossing the Rapidan River, and Lee set out to intercept him and tried to hold him inside the woods, where it would be difficult for a Union army of about 125,000 men to bring their larger force to bear on a Confederate army of about 60,000. Trapped in the woods, much of the fighting would be isolated and relegated to roads. The wilderness is a nightmare to maneuver in, but it would be infinitely harder for a bigger force than a smaller force. They abruptly ran into each other on the Orange Courthouse Turnpike, where you see Ewell on the map, and that's modern-day Route 20. And the first shots of the wilderness touched off a firestorm of action. Grant's initiation to battle in the East started off with a studied effort at savoir-faire. Grant tried to make everything seem to be lighthearted and almost carefree. At one point, he even sat down and joked with a war correspondent who asked the impertinent question, how long would it take Grant to get to Richmond? Grant answered off the cuff, it would take about 3 days. But adding with a wink, Lee has to be party to it. meaning that if the road was wide open, traveling to Richmond would take a normal person 3 days. But Grant had never encountered a battle of the magnitude or the intensity of the Battle of the Wilderness. The losses were extreme. The Union Army would lose almost 18,000 men in 2 days. And Grant lost a little bit of his composure. He sat down and whittled on sticks and smoked cigars, as you can see in the sketch done by a Civil War soldier named Charles Reed, who did it from observing the general. But even this pose is going to fall flat for Grant. Grant wound up smoking or chain smoking 20 cigars in just the first day at the Battle of the Wilderness. So much for being calm and carefree. And as for his whittling, Grant went into the wilderness with a brand new pair of kid-skin gloves that were a present from his wife when he had been promoted to Lieutenant General of the Army. While whittling, he not only whittled the sticks, but accidentally whittled off the fingers of his brand new gloves. So things didn't look so good after that. After 2 days of fighting at the Wilderness, Grant went into his tent and did something that no one had ever seen him do. He collapsed and burst into tears and cried. It was unnerving to a staff officer that inadvertently walked in on him. On the other side of the line, Robert E. Lee had never encountered the ferocity that the Union Army of the Potomac was showing at the Wilderness. They had a newfound tenacity to them, and Lee literally went to the brink of destruction at one point with a major Union attack on the bottom of the map that overwhelmed his lines and crushed part of his position, and Lee literally was watching his army dissolve. In a panic, Robert E. Lee grabbed a small group of Texans who arrived on the field and attempted to lead them in a counterattack personally. The soldiers yelled him back to safety, chanting "Lee to the rear" at the top of their lungs, before he was eventually regained his composure and moved further to the rear. In the course of this battle, Robert E. Lee also lost his second in command. A general named James Longstreet was in eerily similar circumstances to Stonewall Jackson, launching a flank attack through the Wilderness in May, when, at the height of his success, got caught in the mistaken fire of his own men. Unlike Stonewall Jackson, he lived to tell about it, but for the moment, Robert E. Lee was deprived of one of his most reliable subordinates. Both Grant and Lee proved that while they had been tested like they had never been before, they were also both tremendously resilient and quickly came up with the next step. Going to the brink of disaster, Robert E. Lee launched a series of counterattacks, and for the rest of the Battle of the Wilderness was on the offensive, forcing General Grant to react rather than act. For Grant's point of view, he made probably the single most fateful military decision of the entire war, when he decided to disengage from the Wilderness and, instead of retreating, to press deeper into Spotsylvania County. Once the Union Army started on the march, the Confederates also had to depart from the Wilderness and move deeper into Spotsylvania, looking to keep an eye on what the Union Army was doing. Here you can see Grant literally being cheered by the men as they're marching out of the Wilderness, not heading north, but heading south. And they were heading towards the Crossroads at Spotsylvania Court House, the county seat. In the course of this move to Spotsylvania Courthouse, both armies targeted this crossroads, but neither side knew that the other was heading in that direction. Neither side intended to fight at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and neither side knew that they were in an inadvertent foot race to get to the critical crossroads. Spotsylvania provided the North with a direct road south to Richmond. And if you're Looking at the center of the map to the right, you can see Spotsylvania Court House and the road that leads straight south past Zion Church. That was the target for the Army. That's why they coveted the Crossroads. But Spotsylvania also provided the Southerners with two roads that faced northward and covered all the approaches to Spotsylvania from either the Wilderness or Fredericksburg. And you can see the two roads emanate out of Spotsylvania, making Spotsylvania look like a large capital Y with the road networks. The two armies literally bumped into each other about 2 miles outside the courthouse on the Brock Road, which is where you see Warren at the top of the map. This came as a surprise to both the Union and the Confederates. It's what we would call a meeting engagement. And at that point, both armies scrambled to get more and more troops to the field and make a decisive impact. Grant trying to open up the road and seize Spotsylvania and have the inside track to Richmond. Lee reacting as fast as he can to block that road. The meeting engagement literally stymied the Union advance. The first Union troops there were led by General Gouverneur Kimball Warren of the United States Fifth Corps. You can see his troops in the middle of the map, and the sketch at the bottom is General Warren at Spotsylvania on May 8th at the opening gambit at Spotsylvania. He had promised his men that it would be a cakewalk to get into Spotsylvania, even when they met with some resistance. He told the men never to mind cannon, never to mind bullets, press ahead with the promise that's the only way you'll get your breakfast. He quickly changed his tune, screaming at the men to rally by him, which is exactly how he'd been caught in this sketch. It's also interesting to note that Union forces approached Spotsylvania from two different directions. And you'll see on the right of the map, in blue, Ambrose Burnside in the United States Ninth Corps. Just by Burnside's presence on a different road, compelled the Confederates to bend back their lines and create this unique bulging position that you see on the map. The Confederates had a homey term for it. They referred to it as a mule shoe because it looked like something you could shod a horse or a mule with. And in military terms, it's called a salient and very difficult to defend. Grant launched a series of piecemeal assaults against this mule shoe, but to no avail. In fact, things went from bad to worse for the Union High Command because Grant's chief subordinates were literally at each other's throats over the mismanagement of getting to Spotsylvania. The head of cavalry was a gentleman named Phil Sheridan, and making his debut in the East did not do so well. He lost the initiative, lost the road, at one point lost his entire command, and wandered off aimlessly. It was not impressive. The Army commander who's serving immediately under Grant, but still the nominal commander of the Army of the Potomac, was a general named George Gordon Meade. Meade did not suffer fools gladly and was pretty harsh about Sheridan. But Sheridan surprised everybody by being even more critical of Meade, saying that Meade had no business directing the Union cavalry because he had no idea how to manage cavalry. And he promised that if you had just left me alone, I could whip the Confederate cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, which is an obnoxious statement when you consider that cavalry wasn't supposed to be about combat. They were supposed to be about clearing roads and about gathering intelligence and providing information and screening an army. Combat was the least important thing that they did. But Sheridan had proclaimed it was the only thing he knew to do. When Meade shared that with Grant, Grant made the decision to let Sheridan go on a raid towards Richmond. It didn't matter whether he whipped Stuart as he promised or if he even met Stuart. What was important to Grant was that he separated George Meade from Phil Sheridan at this critical point. Otherwise, he would have to get one or both of them reassigned somewhere. That would have big ramifications for the army around Spotsylvania. For the next several days, the Union Army would literally flail blindly without its eyes and ears. Robert E. Lee was able to successfully thwart just about every attack the Union Army launched against his muleshoe. But Lee's high command was also in turmoil at this point. Lee had lost his number one subordinate, James Longstreet, at the Wilderness. He only had 4 principal commanders, so 25% were already gone before they got to Spotsylvania. And then the rest of it started to fall apart too. Confederate Corps Commander General Ambrose Powell Hill became too sick to stay in the field and keep active service. He had to be replaced. Another Corps Commander, Richard Ewell, had an infected stump where he had lost his leg earlier in the war and was starting to become unpredictable. There were times when he was manic. There were times that he was cautious, but no one could predict exactly what Ewell would show up at any given time. Ewell still kept his command because you'll see the big names on the map. Longstreet's name's not there. Richard Herron Anderson's name is. A.P. Hill's name isn't there, but Jubal Early's name is. Anderson will prove to be a very capable, reliable, but uninspired commander. Jubal Early would prove to be a rather irascible and difficult person to work with, but a very gifted leader. At this particular moment, neither one of them had commanded a corps before coming onto this field. Lee was looking at 2/3 of his corps in unfamiliar hands. And before the week was out, the only healthy one left, Jeb Stuart, he would depart from Spotsylvania to shadow Phil Sheridan on his raid towards Richmond. With the Union Army stymied and unable to get into Spotsylvania, unable to break through the Confederate lines, it took a Union colonel, a 24-year-old man from New York named Emory Upton, shown here, to set Grant straight. He had a bold proposal for a novel type of attack, insisting that traditional battle lines covering a large front were getting heavy casualties all across the front and ran out of momentum before they could even reach the Confederate lines, much less beat them. He proposed to put his men on a very narrow front and stack them very deep like a battering ram. And if you're looking at the top center of the map, in yellow highlight, you'll see 6:10 p.m. with Upton's name right next to it, with his unusual setup of men. This battering ram of troops would bludgeon their way into the Confederate lines on May 10th, just at sunset. And then once they got in, they would literally separate and spread out, expanding their breakthrough as best they could. The attack was a huge success, at least for a moment. Robert E. Lee was again imperiled, facing crisis. He literally tried to lead another counterattack, and yet another chorus of troops yelling "Lee to the rear" prevented him from getting into the mix with Emory Upton. From Upton's point of view, he was willing to do whatever it took, not only for success, but also for advancement. He was a highly ambitious man who dearly wanted to be a general and was fighting hard to earn his star. He had done his part, but nobody else was ready to support him. There were no backups. Without reinforcements, Upton ran out of steam. The Confederates were able to contain the breakthrough and force him back out with heavy losses of his own. Ordinarily, that would be considered yet another Union setback. But to Grant, he saw it as an opportunity. He not only granted Upton his star, but he was heard to say that a brigade today, meaning a small unit of about 5,000, a corps tomorrow. He was going to do this attack like Upton had, but do it on a much bigger scale. Instead of 5,000 men, he was going to use 20,000 men. Not only use 20,000 men, he was going to focus in on the weakest part of the entire Confederate defense. And that was the tip, of the Muleshoe. The tip was always weak, but the Union Army didn't attack it for 4 days. That's largely because it took them 4 days to even figure out the size and shape of the Confederate lines. If Sheridan's cavalry had been there, perhaps they would have been able to determine that earlier and maybe struck at it before the Confederates had very elaborate defensive earthworks, entrenchments. But it wasn't until May 12th that the Union Army was going to strike right at the tip of that Confederate line. General Grant tagged the United States Second Corps to make this attack, 19,000 of his best shock troops. On the evening of May 11th, he took them from the very far right of his lines and had them march behind Warren to set up for a dawn attack on May 12th. It started to rain on the evening of the 11th, and it was a tremendously grueling night for the soldiers getting through the pitch blackness around Spotsylvania Court House. On the march, there was a lot of hurry up and wait. Men became frustrated and angry. One of the Union division commanders, named Francis Channing Barlow, admitted that when he got angry, he would get sarcastic. And when the guide pointing him to the jump-off spot admitted he got lost, Barlow all but throttled him by saying, "For God's sakes, man, at least point me in the direction of the enemy so that I don't inadvertently go all the way around the world and strike them from behind." It impressed the guide enough that he eventually found his way out to a spot called the Brown Farm, which is directly at the top of your map. Once they got there, they met with Union forces that had occupied the area for the last couple days and were anxious to get a picture of what the Confederate line looked like and what they would be attacking before dawn. They were shocked at the answers they got. According to the generals that met, they talked to a colonel named Waldo Merriam, and Merriam couldn't answer any of their questions. When they asked if the Confederates were in strength, Merriam said, "I didn't know." Do the Confederates have artillery? He said yes, because they had been fired upon. But how much artillery, he had no idea. He didn't know the lay of the land. He didn't know what their defenses looked like. And sarcastic General Barlow struck again and asked, "Do you mean to tell me that there might be a chasm between us and the Confederates that's 1,000 feet wide and 100 yards deep, and you don't know about it?" To which Colonel Merriam answered, "Yes, we don't know." Barlow decided that the whole point of this attack was to do Upton's experimental attack on a grand scale, and he stacked his men very deep, which you can see appearing on the map. But all the other Union commanders of the Second Corps were not as excited. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what they were going to be striking. They didn't know what to expect. They had no control over any aspect of the attack, except one thing, and that was how they went in. If they started experimenting at this point, it's hard to say how comfortable they would be saying they had control over that too. So they went back to their traditional battle lines, which you can see as the bigger blocks on the map. The whole point of doing the attack had already been changed before they ever stepped off. Even with General Barlow being more optimistic about Upton's way of attacking, he still wasn't very optimistic about the outcome. When he walked out of the Brown Farm meeting, he turned to his staff and said, "Gentlemen, we start the attack within the hour." And he recommended that they take that time to fill out their last will. On the Confederate side, during the night of the 11th, even with the rain coming, they heard the Union Army on the march. It's pretty hard to hide 20,000 men marching through the darkness. They make a lot of noise. It became so painfully obvious at one point that a Union band went out into the front trenches and serenaded the troops just to hide the sound of the march with music. If listening to Hail Columbia at midnight in a rainstorm doesn't sound suspicious, you're probably not paying attention. But it was a matter of what the Confederates thought it meant. For the Confederate High Command, Robert E. Lee included, they had seen this type of movement before. The Union Army had been fought to a standstill, stalemated on the battlefield, and then they sidestepped. Grant left the wilderness and came to Spotsylvania, and the Confederates narrowly avoided disaster by beating them in a foot race by a matter of minutes and yards. It was obvious to Lee that the Union Army had been stalemated again, and that they were sidestepping Spotsylvania. In anticipation of that, Lee prepared to put his men on the march to stay ahead, so there would not be a foot race. The people who were most poorly situated to get on the road out of Spotsylvania were the ones in the tip of the mule shoe. There weren't a lot of roads up that way, so that position was ordered to be abandoned. But it was raining, and the men who were in the trenches had put shelter tents over the top of their trenches just to stay dry. The appeal was to let them sleep for the night and that they could catch up easily in the morning. But there was also a lot of artillery up in the mule shoe, and it would be very difficult for them to maneuver through those woodlots that you see. They had to go immediately. As the night unfolded and the noise of the Union troops progressed across the front, it stopped at the Brown farm, and in fact grew as more and more troops marshaled around the Brown farm. For the Confederates in the very tip of the mule shoe, they quickly realized this wasn't the Union Army leaving Spotsylvania. This was the Union Army preparing to attack Spotsylvania from a different angle. They begged for the artillery to be sent back at once. It would take several hours to find it, to even send them back. Turns out Robert E. Lee was again in another foot race, where it became a matter of whether the Union Army would attack first or the artillery would get back in time. For the Confederates in the mule shoe, they were under no illusion. A Louisiana soldier shouted out in the darkness and the rain, "Wide awake, there will be blood for breakfast." At 4:35 a.m. on May 12, 1864, the weather around Spotsylvania was still terrible. The rain had let up somewhat. It was a light mist. There was a ground fog that had come up. The temperature had dropped unseasonably. Visibility around Spotsylvania was about 35 to 50 yards at best. People could make out big things like tree lines, but all the nuances of the landscape and people had all but been obliterated. At 4:35, the Union Army rolled forward. They were told as last-minute instructions that the Confederates were located on top of a hill. They had artillery, and that the attack needed to keep absolute secrecy and surprise until the last moment. So Union soldiers were told that they were not allowed to go forward cheering, lest they tell the Confederates they're coming. They were also told they were not allowed to fire their weapons until they were inside the Confederate lines. As they rolled forward, they hit a Confederate skirmish line out in front of the main mule shoe. Pickets or guards that were sent out there as an early warning detection. The Union troops overran the skirmish line. There was a quick exchange of fire from some of the Confederates, responded to by the Union, and then everything erupted in shouting and cheering because the Confederates had been found on a ridge, just as the Union troops were promised. It's only the more discerning who realized that the resistance was too light, that they quickly recognized that even in the fog, there was another ridge, a bigger ridge that still was ahead of them. The only thing that the Union Army had going for it was surprise until this moment. But once they cheered, all the Confederates who had been waiting for blood for breakfast now knew that the attack was coming, and they were ready. As the Union troops surged forward as fast as they could, they made a mad dash for the Confederate lines. The Confederates opened fire on them and hit almost nobody. The problem was in the fog, they couldn't really see the Union forces. or appreciate that as they rolled forward, they had to go through a valley that made them literally disappear from view. The Confederates had fired at the Sound, which had been on the opposite side of this little valley on higher ground. So the bullets literally went over the heads of the Union troops. Barlow's men reached the main Confederate line, as seen in this wonderful lithograph, overran the Confederate line, caught them in hand-to-hand combat, and inundated them. In a matter of just a couple of minutes, really, the Confederate line was ruptured. The Union Army was able to capture 2 Confederate generals in the tip of the Muleshoe, including the commander of the entire Muleshoe, a gentleman named Edward Johnson. They captured over 3,000 prisoners. They captured over a dozen battle flags. And at this inauspicious moment, the belated Confederate cavalry, or artillery, I should say, showed up just in time to be captured as well. As the Union forces poured over top of the Confederate earthworks, a Union colonel named James A. Beaver was exhorting his men, saying, "Wide awake, boys. The last day of the rebellion is at hand." They sensed that the decisive victory that they had craved since the campaign had begun was right now in front of them in Spotsylvania County. Robert E. Lee initially was unsure of what had happened in the top of the Muleshoe. As some of the survivors came fleeing back past his headquarters, he decided to react and try to patch yet another small breakthrough. He ordered General John Brown Gordon to send forward his division in a counterattack. Gordon's men were literally the only reserve Robert E. Lee had in his entire army. They were a rapid response force that were supposed to fill any hole on any part of the line. As Gordon attempted to go forward with his men, they came under intense fire. It was tough for them to move forward quickly and decisively. And Robert E. Lee, again, for the third time, attempted to lead a counterattack personally. The men again shouted, "Lee to the rear," at the McCool farm, which is shown here on the right-hand side of a Sidney King painting of the early morning hours of May 12th, 1864. Gordon was able to compel Robert E. Lee to back off, and then he launched a counterattack against Union forces in the background, driving them into the woods and towards the tip of the Muleshoe. But Gordon came up short of restoring the entire line. He only had a couple thousand men, and the Union Army had about 20,000 opposing him. He was able to drive them backwards, but he was unable to restore the entire line. At that moment, Robert E. Lee had just launched his best shot. Everything after this was going to be crisis management. Lee needed a new plan, and he needed one quickly. Robert E. Lee decided that with the center of the Muleshoe being in Union hands, his right wing and his left wing were no longer physically connected to each other. And if they were going to survive, even to fight another day, it was essential to get those two wings reunited as fast as possible. Lee determined to build a new line of defenses along the base of the Muleshoe and tie those two wings back together. The Confederate commander put Richard Ewell's survivors from the tip of the Muleshoe to work, digging a new set of earthworks or trenches. He also had teamsters and pioneers working to reattach those two severed wings of his army. At the same time, Lee went up and down the remaining lines and extracted individual units and sent them forward in a series of piecemeal attacks. None of them were strong enough to drive the Union Army out of the Muleshoe, but each one was just to make sure that the Union forces were kept back away from the new line until it was constructed. It was important to keep the Union forces off balance instead of moving forward. Lee was willing at this point to do something that no commander finds easy, and that was he had to make the decision that he was going to trade lives for time, and time for the very life of the Army itself. The action at Spotsylvania on May 12th turned into an ugly meat grinder, where units were literally thrown into a buzzsaw and used up just in time for Lee to send yet another unit in. In the course of the day, Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia lost 13 generals or acting generals in the course of the combat. And of those 13, he lost 12 of them before 10 in the morning on May 12th. The 13th died a little later in the day, and that was Jeb Stuart, who had fallen fighting against Sheridan at a place called Yellow Tavern just outside Richmond. He'd been mortally wounded on May 11th and succumbed to his wounds on May 12th, even as the fighting at Spotsylvania had reached its zenith. When you think about 13 generals or acting generals lost in one day, this is probably the single costliest day in Robert E. Lee's army for losing leadership. I can't think of another day that Lee lost 13 acting generals or general officers. And everything on May 12th literally came to a white heat at one particular point, a tiny little kink in the earthworks that both sides needed to hold on to as if their lives depended on it. The spot soon was christened the Bloody Angle. The intensity of the action was an all or nothing proposition for both sides. The Confederates were literally fighting for survival. Their goal was simply to live to see yet another day. If they couldn't hold this spot, the Army of Northern Virginia ceased to exist on May 12, 1864. For the Union Army, it was equally as intense because they sensed that the end of the entire war might very well be at hand right at the end of their bayonets if they could just get the leverage to unhinge the Confederate defense. So both sides plowed forward with a new sense of purpose and intensity. And the fighting literally took on a sublime or a surreal quality. Literally, time and space lost all meaning in the closeness of the combat, as men literally fought from each side of the earthworks with only the logs of the earthworks to divide them. 9:30 in the morning became 10, 10 became 11, 11 became noon, and they continued to battle away face to face, hacking at each other. The Union Army pulled in more troops. Eventually, elements of all the different Army corps were engaged at some point in the fight against the Muleshoe. And still, Grant could not break the impasse. The battle itself literally slipped beyond the control of the commanders, both high and low. According to one Union officer, his men fought like fiends at the Bloody Angle. To a Confederate on the other side, he said that the men behaved like demons. Fiends and demons has an interesting connotation in the 19th century. We're not talking about men. We're not talking about soldiers. We're not talking about disciplined and thoughtful action. Fiends and demons went to the most base, primitive, visceral aspects of survival. It was either to be killed or to kill. And that's the one essential ingredient of everybody who was fighting literally face to face with their opponent as the hours slipped by. Noon became 1 p.m., 1 p.m. became 2 p.m., 2 p.m. became 3 p.m. And the sights around the Bloody Angle were grisly beyond comprehension. A Union soldier whose eyes had been gouged out by a bullet sat there dumbfounded because he suddenly couldn't see and kept blinking his eyes, hoping to clear them, only to have blood spray on the people around him. A staff officer giving orders to a commander only to have a shell cleave off his bottom jaw. Without knowing it, his tongue continued to flick as if he was still giving the order, but all sound had ceased. Bodies literally stacked up underfoot like cordwood. but nobody could stop to help the wounded or to help them see. 3 p.m. became 4 p.m., 4 p.m. became 5 p.m., and 5 p.m. became 6 p.m. And the armies brought out every kind of weapon they could to gain an advantage. The Union Army introduced small mortars directly into combat for the first time to hit the tree line behind the Confederates to prevent them from getting reinforcements or getting ammunition. But there was none coming. For the Confederates, many of them ran out of ammunition, and many of them didn't care. They didn't find their weapons efficient enough to kill fast enough. According to a Mississippi soldier, the weapon of choice were camp hatchets, small axes that if they could parry the thrust of a Union bayonet, they could brain the holder just by striking him overhead with a hatchet. According to one Mississippian, Thomas Roach, he said that it was so efficient that the blood fairly oozed in the tops of our boots. Not welling in from the bottom, but swelling through the top. They were virtually standing in puddles of blood. 7 p.m. became 8 p.m. 8 p.m. became 9 p.m. 9 p.m. became 10 p.m. Now, normally, darkness on a Civil War battlefield would mean the end of combat, but not at Spotsylvania. Darkness only intensified the horror. They continued to battle face to face. At one point, a Michigan officer launched an impromptu attack over top of the Confederate earthworks, and in the process was beaten back in a matter of seconds. Captain Nathan Church lost his best friend on top of those Confederate works and vowed that he would come back and bury that man later. 10 p.m. became 11 p.m., and 11 p.m. became midnight, and they were still fighting. 11 or 12 midnight became 1 a.m., and they were still fighting. 1 became 2 a.m., and they were still battling in the darkness face to face. And 2 a.m. became 3 a.m., and they had been fighting around the Muleshoe for 22 uninterrupted hours. But by 3 a.m., Robert E. Lee had a brand new line across the base of the old Muleshoe, and he summoned the survivors back. And the last to go were those who were in the tip of the Muleshoe. And as they slipped away, Grant's best opportunity to end the war with a decisive victory also slipped away. The storm blew itself out on May 13th, and the armies continued to maneuver and look for opportunities. Action would occur again on Myers Hill on May 14th. An assault on Lee's last line would happen on May 18th. A Confederate strike would happen against the Union lines on May 19th at Harris Farm. But the whirlwind at Spotsylvania was largely over, and the cost had been horrific. The Union Army lost over 18,000 men at Spotsylvania Court House in just 2 weeks of maneuvering here. The Confederates had lost over 12,000 men. Now, the overall total casualties amounted to more than 30,000 killed, wounded, and missing soldiers in Spotsylvania County. The McCool Farm, arguably, is the most blood-drenched piece of property in all of America. Men had struggled to come to terms with the devastation that was wrought on Spotsylvania County. Nathan Church, who had lost his best friend in a nighttime attack on the Muleshoe, returned to the spot to bury that man, and he couldn't find him. He had literally been hit by so many bullets, his body had disintegrated. Eventually, Church found a tuft of telltale red hair as the only reminder that that person even existed at one time, and he wound up burying that little tuft. The casualty that was most symbolic of the singular intensity of the combat at Spotsylvania, and and also the power of loss, was not any individual North or South, but a tree. There was an oak tree that stood directly behind the bloody angle that had an impressive 22-inch diameter, and the tree was literally cut down during the fighting just by bullets striking it. And you can see that in the lower right, what that looks like. Today, it's in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. It has been hailed as literally the most iconic artifact of the entire Civil War. The soldiers had never seen anything like that, and they struggled to articulate that and the losses of the men who fell at Spotsylvania. They referred to Spotsylvania as a Golgotha, a place of skulls, a place of death. They called it Hell's Half Acre. A soldier named Thomas Hyde could tell you without any feeling or empathy or compassion about a friend's head being blown off by a cannonball. But when it came to talking about Spotsylvania, he tried several times to write letters home, and in the end, simply wrote that I won't tell you about Spotsylvania because you won't believe me. For I was there, and I scarcely believe it myself. The photograph in the background, you can see a placard up on the tree that's nailed there with a stanza from Theodore O'Hara's Bivouac of the Dead, which is something that appears in national cemeteries around the country. This is a vivid reminder that the entire area of Spotsylvania had become one vast cemetery in and of itself because of this action. Spotsylvania didn't end the campaign between Grant and Lee. In fact, within 2 weeks of sparking combat outside of the courthouse, Grant and Lee were both on the move again. The campaign picked up speed and momentum. As you can see on this map, they moved across the state of Virginia to the North Anna River, to Totopotomoy Creek, to Cold Harbor, and to Petersburg. The armies literally battled their way across the state of Virginia, but no more would battles reach the bloody intensity and zenith of Spotsylvania Court House. The Battle of Spotsylvania Court House was literally the last of the monumentally bloody battles in the Civil War. But what did the Battle of Spotsylvania achieve? It was a military stalemate. Conceivably, you can argue it was a political stalemate as well. Grant needed to win, and yet victory eluded him. But one thing that Spotsylvania Courthouse gives us is a profound amount of bloodletting, 30,000 casualties, but arguably a necessary amount of bloodshed. "11 months later, April 9th, 1865, at another courthouse village, Appomattox Courthouse, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant met in the Mcclellan house to discuss surrender. And when they met, there was an interesting greeting. Robert E. Lee wore his finest uniform out of respect for for Ulysses S. Grant, explaining to subordinates that he expected to be Grant's prisoner and must make his best presentation. Grant showed up in a mud-daubed uniform, also a mark of respect. He had a dress uniform with him, but he didn't want to waste the time changing and make Lee wait and agonize longer than he had to. He respected Lee's time. When they met face to face, they shook hands. And Grant said something that history has a tendency to overlook or throw away, but I think it's a very important line. Grant's first words were, "We met once before, General Lee, in Mexico." He hearkened back to a time when they weren't adversaries, but were colleagues, when they had fought on the same side with the same vision and the same purpose. He referred to him as General Lee, giving him rank and title, these were marks of respect all around. Now remember, when the campaign started, Robert E. Lee and General Grant didn't have very high opinions of each other. And yet, 11 months later, after things like Spotsylvania Court House, they had the utmost respect for each other. So the question is, what if Grant had succeeded at Spotsylvania Court House on May 12th, and that had been the last day of the war? Would there have been this same mark of respect and the same terms? Some looked at Spotsylvania County as a vast battlefield of disappointments and frustrations, extravagant losses in battle after battle fought in a county between 1864 or 1862 and 1864. Decisive victory eluded both sides. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse. And neither side was able to overcome the other to find the end game that would justify the loss of lives and property. Some would argue that the fight at the Bloody Angle was over a piece of worthless ground that the Confederates gave up once they built a new and better line, ground that the Union Army fought to own and then abandoned within 48 hours. Worthless militarily. But the ground was far from worthless to those who sacrificed here. Nathan Church, the man who buried the tuft of hair, the only remains of his friend, returned to Spotsylvania Courthouse years later and met with the veterans he had fought against. And he spoke of the fields and woods around Spotsylvania County and its courthouse. And this is what he said. It wasn't worthless. This ground is hallowed ground, because there is no other ground that has drunk so deeply of brave men's blood. If ground is truly hallowed, then Spotsylvania County is sanctified land. Cemeteries like the National Cemetery in Fredericksburg, or the Confederate Cemetery in Spotsylvania Courthouse, or the Confederate Cemetery in Fredericksburg, record the price of lasting peace, that grudging respect that was born of adversity. They paid a price, but it is up to us and to our world and what we do with that will ultimately decide the worth of their sacrifice.
All right, thank you very much. So, folks, we're going to take some questions now. We still have a bit of time. We're going to wrap this up by 8 o'clock at the latest, okay? Okay, we have a comment from Pamela. I loved hearing what the two generals thought of each other before they met in battle and then after they fought. Is that something you see a lot in military history?
It's pretty interesting that they had an interesting assessment of each other. Not only did they think that each had fought against easier opponents, but they almost went out of their way to dismiss the other among their own subordinates. When it came to Lee talking to his Chief Lieutenant James Longstreet, Longstreet knew Grant very well. In fact, had introduced Grant to Mrs. Grant, had been in Grant's wedding. So he had a very good understanding of the character of the man. But when he tried to tell Lee about it, Lee dismissed it as he's just another commander from the West, and not the first one who had been sent east. The previous one, John Pope, set a record as being an Army commander for only 70 days before he lost his job against Robert E. Lee. So if Pope was considered to be better than Grant, Grant didn't have much hope. For Grant's point of view, he thought that the Union Army in Virginia had too healthy a respect for Lee and went out of his way to be almost irreverent about it. He didn't refer to General Lee back then. He referred to him as Bobby, diminished him to the stature and status of a child, to the point where he chastised Union officers who had respect. saying Bobby Lee this and Bobby Lee that. You would think that Bobby Lee could do triple somersaults and wind up on both our flanks and in our rear at the same time. I'm sick and tired of hearing what Bobby Lee can do. I want to hear what we can do to Bobby Lee. So he set a tone with the understanding that the Union Army was afraid to win. They were afraid to fight. It's only after he saw them in action against Lee that he realized they're not afraid to fight at all. Things like the Bloody Angle were a wake-up call to General Grant, that they had their work cut out for them. For Lee's point of view, Spotsylvania also is that turning point in his assessment of Grant. Following the fighting at the Bloody Angle, the surviving Confederate generals had a meeting in which they spent much of their time just trying to puff each other up to raise each other's morale after such a disaster. And they came to the conclusion that Grant had no ability. They called him a butter. He just liked to butt his head against things. And their assessment is if he continues to butt, we will continue to destroy him. It was Lee who interrupted their reverie by making the very quiet assessment that, gentlemen, if you ask my opinion, General Grant has handled his affairs quite well up to this point, I think. That would not have been an answer even a week before. So Spotsylvania is an important turning point in the assessment of the generals to each other. After that, it only continues to grow. So perhaps Spotsylvania's greatest endearing legacy is that the birth of that respect is also going to be the foundation of lasting peace.
Thank you. All right, folks, if you have any more questions, we still have a bit of time. Feel free to put them in the comments and we'll take them as they come in. All right. And if not, if you'd like to, would you discuss a little bit about the book you're working on currently?
Oh, great. Right now I'm writing a book on an 1862 battle called Melbourne Hill, which was the conclusion of the 7 days battles around Richmond. And today, July 1st, is actually the anniversary of the Battle of Melbourne Hill. It was a climactic struggle in which Robert E. Lee was making a last desperate gambit to cripple the Union Army before it was able to escape to the safety of the James River and the United States Navy. A number of headlong assaults against the Union lines were bloodily repulsed. It was a terrible one-sided affair. But in the end, as badly mauled as the Confederates were, the Union commander, George McClellan, opted to give up Malvern Hill and retreat to the river anyway, giving up all the fruits of his victory and making it a Confederate victory by default. Malvern Hill is going to have several big, profound legacies. One is that it's going to prove that the Confederate Army could successfully defend its own capital against a direct threat right outside its gates. That gave them legitimacy in the eyes of European nations who were considering whether they were going to recognize the Confederacy officially or not. It also validated the Confederacy in the minds of many Southerners who were kind of on the fence, wondering if this experiment in a Southern Confederacy was real and whether it would last. People spoke of themselves as Virginians or Carolinians or Georgians, but rarely used the term that they were Confederates until after the 7 days. And so, in one sense, it creates a nation, at least for the secessionist, becoming a confederacy. Now, it also has a bigger ramification that once Southerners start identifying themselves as Confederates rather than Americans, that changes the dynamic of the war. It goes from being a rebellion, where one part is literally rebelling against another part, to a revolution. A rebellion is something that could be organized between armies and even governments, but revolution is something between peoples and cultures. And if this was going to foment a true Confederate identity, then the United States has a bigger opponent to attack. Abraham Lincoln's going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation as a military order, with the understanding that now it's not only attacking Confederate armies or attacking the Confederate government, but also attacking the infrastructure that supports and sustains that army and that government, which means the Southern economy and the Southern society and the Southern workforce. So enslaved people now became a military target, and becomes the foundation of why Abraham Lincoln, as Commander-in-Chief, can issue Emancipation Proclamation. So one of the most revolutionary documents ever to hit the Western world is born out of all things, a Confederate victory by default.
Thank you. Okay, it looks like we have another question. Did Upton's battle approach ever gain favor, or was it cast aside?
I'm glad you asked that. That's a great question. Upton was truly revolutionary for what he was proposing on May 10th, and has even been hailed by the nickname the father of modern infantry tactics. But as impressive as that is, Upton was refuted within a month as defenses, earthworks, entrenchments became more sophisticated and more elaborate, and killing fields became even more treacherous. That by the first week of June, Upton was refuted by no less a person than Emory Upton. Asked to make an attack at a place called Cold Harbor, he aborted the attack when he thought there was no possibility of even doing it with his revolutionary style. So it was a success for him, but a short-lived one.
All right, folks, we still have a few more minutes. If you want to put any questions or comments in the chat, you can go ahead and do so now. And we'll give it a minute or so, see if we get anything else.
Well, I want to thank everybody for spending a little bit of time with me tonight to talk about Spotsylvania and to talk about the Bloody Angle and the fighting around Spotsylvania Court House. Thank you for that.
So if folks are visiting the battlefields, is there anything they should know in particular right now?
Great question. The Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park administers 4 battlefields around Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania. The Battle of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania Courthouse itself. These battlefields are all set up as self-guided driving tours for the most part. We also have a number of excellent hiking trails that will give you access to all the critical areas of fighting on all of these battlefields. We have visitor centers with the National Park Service at Fredericksburg and at Chancellorsville with staff that would be delighted to talk to you about all of these battlefields and how to maximize your experience in seeing these fields. During weekends this summer, we will have Park Service staff out at Spotsylvania Courthouse Battlefield and the Wilderness Battlefield to orient visitors to those battles and their significance and see some of the sites.
Great. So we have a comment from Pamela. She says, thanks for making the story come alive. Thank you for joining us this evening. So for folks listening, I just want to let you know about our next one for August. We're going to have Terry Doherty of the Spotsylvania Museum present on From Colony to Commonwealth. So tune in for that. That's going to be the first Thursday in August. So join us then. So thanks again, Frank, for appearing with us, and we'll end that here for now.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to spend some time with you all. Have a great night.